So, dear students, last time we talked about Kamala Das and her poem, My Mother I explained half of the poem to you. Today I'm gonna explain the another half of the poem to you. Now, the next line says, so far, you see, the poet was driving from her parents' home to Cochin last Friday morning, and then she saw her mother sitting beside her, and her mother was dozing off. She was an old woman, and so she was dozing off. She was too sleepy and tired and weak, and so because she was dozing off, her mouth was open. So she was open mouthed at the time, and her face was weak and it was inactive like a dead body's. And then the poet realized with pain that her mother was really as old as she looked. And she realized this with pain because if her mother was really so old, soon she's gonna have to die, and if she dies, the poet would be separated from her. That's why she realized with pain. That's why the poet realized with pain that her mother was really as old as she looked, and that the poet was soon gonna lose her. But then the poet put that thought away. She diverted her mind. And what she did is, she looked outside the window, and there she saw young trees running. I mean, not running actually, but they seemed to run with the car. And then she saw happy children coming out of their homes. So there was a contrast between her mother and the kids that were coming out of their house. There was you see, her mother's face was compared to that of her dead body. See, her face was Asian, inactive, dead, but the children were so happy. There was joy, gladness on their face. So there is a contrast, and by contrast, the poet has been able to effectively communicate the oldness of her mothers. So the next line says, but after the airport's security check, standing a few yards away, I looked again at her worn pale as a late winter's moon, and felt that old familiar ache, my childhood's fear. So let me write each line and then explain it to you. But after the airport's security check. So there was a security check at the airport, and after that, the poet stood a few steps away from her mother. So she says, standing a few yards away. So when they reached the airport, there was a security check, and after that, the poet stood a few yards from her mother. And then she looked again at her worn, pale face. She says, I looked again at her worn, pale and face, So the poet stood a few steps from her mother, and then she looked again at her mother's face, and it was weak, faded, and pale. Pale means yellow color. When you go yellow, when the color of your skin goes yellow because of sickness or weakness or old age, then you are pale. Sometimes it goes yellow because of nervousness also. But here, the mother's face was pale because she was too old, weak, faded. So the poet looked at her mother, who was worn, pale. Her face was worn and pale. Her face was weak, faded, and pale. Worn, weak, and faded, and pale, yellow color because of sickness or old age. And her face was worn and pale as a late winter's moon. Her face was worn and pale, faded and yellow, faded and pale as a late winter's moon. So the idea is that, in late winter, the moon is not as bright as ever. It is kind of faded. It is kind of pale. It is not that bright. So her mother's face was not bright now. Was not as bright as it was when her mother was young. So we have a wonderful simile here. Her mother's face was as worn and pale as a late winter's moon. The poet has taken this simile from nature, and it really beautifies the poem. And the idea of the paleness and weakness and fadedness of her mother's face is beautifully communicated. But when the poet saw her mother's face, and she saw that her mother was weak and emaciated, and she was very old, and then she felt that old familiar ache, and then she says, and then I felt that old familiar ache. What is this familiar ache? And then let me also write the next phrase that follows this line, and then we'll be able to better understand this. So she says, and felt that old familiar ache, my childhood's fear. So what was the familiar ache? Familiar pain. The pain was pain that that a child feels from fear of losing its mother. The familiar pain or the familiar ache is the ache or the pain that a child feels or experiences from the fear of losing its mother. So the poet has been feeling this pain before also, and she feels it again, because before also when she saw her mother, and her mother was old and weak, and then she knew that her mother would soon die and she'll have to leave this world, and then the poet knew that she would have to live on this earth without her mother. So she felt that old familiar ache, the pain that comes from the fear of losing your dear ones. My childhood's fear. And the poet says, the fear. What is the childhood's fear? What is the fear of the child? The child's fear is the fear of losing its mother. As soon as the mother is taken away from the child starts crying. The child is too afraid to lose its mother, that can't bear separation from it even for 20 minutes. So as the child is afraid to lose its mother, so is the poet afraid to lose her mother, because her mother is too old to live for long now, and she'll soon pass away. So the poet is feeling the same familiar ache that she felt in her childhood, and that she has felt even before, before this drive to Cochin. She's feeling the same the childhood's fear. She's experiencing the child's fear to lose its mother. But then the poet does one thing. She says, "But all I said was, see you soon, Amma. But all I said was, see you soon, Amma." All I did was smile and smile and smile. But the poet didn't reveal her feelings to her mother. She kept them from her. She just said to her mother, "See you soon, Amma." And then she kept smiling and smiling and smiling. So inwardly she was feeling great pain, intense pain in her heart. But outwardly she was smiling. She pretended to be happy, and she said, "See you soon, Amma," because she didn't want her mother to be unhappy. So she kept her feelings to herself. So it was a nice poem. It was an easy poem. I hope you really enjoyed learning it. And that's it. Thank you very much.